Now that we've got tests and implementation in place for viewing an unused invitation, let's drive out viewing an invitation that's already been used and define what we expect that behavior to be. So we'll add a new test case to the bottom of our file here, and why don't we just call it viewing a used invitation. So our setup is going to be similar. We're going to need an invitation to exist, right? So we'll do factory, invitation, class, and then we'll go ahead and create that invitation. But we have to think about what data do we want to create it with. So we're going to need to specify the code similar to how we did above. So why don't we say that the code can be the same code, test code 1234. But we also have to make a decision about what does it mean for an invitation to be used. Does it mean that there's like a used column with a true value, or maybe a timestamp that was originally null and now we've set it to the current time? But I think a good way to go about this would actually be to add a user ID column to the invitations table so we can keep track of which user used which invitation. So why don't we add a user ID column here? And we'll just say that this user ID column is populated, right? So if another user's user ID is in this column, well, then the invitation has been used. So we'll use our factory to create a user to associate with this invitation. So we'll just say factory user class create here. And then I think we're basically done with the setup. So the next step is going to be to make a request to try and visit this invitation's show page, right? So we'll say response equals this get invitations / test code 1234, just like above. But now, instead of expecting that we can actually view the page and the invitation is passed through and stuff, I think what we want to do is just make sure that we get back maybe a 404, because this invitation is no longer visible, right? Because it's already been used up. So let's go ahead and run this test and see what our first error is. Okay, so we get an error about the user, it's looking for it in the wrong namespace. So let's just import the user class. Run the test again. And now we get an error that there is no user ID column on the invitations table. So let's head over to our create invitations table migration and add an unsigned integer column for the user ID. If we head back to the test and run it again, hopefully we're onto a new error. And we were expecting a 404, but we got a 200. So we have to do some sort of work in the controller to determine if this invitation code has already been used, well, then we want to abort and we want to show a 404. So why don't we just write the code that we wish we had? What if we did something like if invitation has been used? Well, why don't we just return a 404? Let's go ahead and run the tests again and see what happens. I think we're going to get an error that there is no has been used method. So we actually get a 500. So let's pull down without exception handling so we can actually see this error more clearly. And yeah, we guessed right, has been used is not defined. So we could drive this out with a unit test, but we've covered that sort of thing so many times throughout this course. I think it's a better idea to just drive this out at the feature level so we can move on to some newer stuff. So let's head over to the actual invitation class and add this method. So it's going to be a public method called has been used. If we go and run the test again, I think they're still going to fail even though the method is defined because of course it's empty. So we're still getting a 200 when we're expecting a 404. So we have to make sure that has been used returns true if there's a user ID associated with this invitation, right? Since that's what we decided is our criteria for determining if an invitation has been used. So why don't we just say return this user ID does not triple equal null. So if the user ID is not null, which means there is some user ID there, then the invitation has been used. So let's go and run this test again. And we're still getting a failure, but this is the right failure. So now we're getting a not found HTTP exception being thrown, which means if we get rid of without exception handling, since this test actually depends on exception handling, that with any luck, we should be in a passing state. And we are. One other thing I'd like to do here quickly before adding the next test is here we've now defined what it means for an invitation to be used, right? Which is that the user ID belongs to a specific user. Up in this test, we've specified that we want to have an unused invitation, but there's nothing here that's clearly stating that the user ID in this case is null. So even though that's the default value coming back from our model factory, I think it's a good idea to add it explicitly here. So you can look at the test and see, yes, the user ID is intentionally null. So let's make that null and run this test again and see what happens. Okay, so we're getting an error that a not null constraint failed because the user ID column is required. So let's head over to our migration and let's make that column nullable so it doesn't have to actually contain a user ID to begin with. Heading back and running this test again. Now we're back to green, so we're in good shape. The last thing I'd like to do in this lesson is quickly cover the case of viewing an invitation that doesn't exist at all. So why don't we just copy this test to get started, and we'll just rename it to be viewing let's call it viewing an invitation that does not exist. So that means we don't have to create an invitation here at all, and we can still specify a code here, but because it doesn't exist, well, it doesn't exist. And then we can just make sure that we still get back a 404. So let's run this and see what we get currently. So currently we're getting a 500, which is not what we want. So why don't we disable exception handling so we can see what the real error is here. Run the test again, and scrolling up, we get an error called a member function has been used on null on line 14. So what's happening is in our controller, find by code is returning null, and then we're trying to call has been used on null, which is triggering an error. So I think what we want to do here is make find by code actually do a first or fail instead of just a first, so that if there is no invitation with that code, it throws a model not found exception. So let's change this implementation to be first or fail. Now if we head back and run this test again, it looks like we're getting a model not found exception, which is expected. So if we handle exceptions as normal again, now we should be green, and we are, which is awesome. One quick thing that we can do to refactor this code a little bit, and it's really small, but it kind of does read a little bit nicer, is instead of doing this conditional here and then aborting if it's been used, we can actually collapse that down into one line using the abort if helper. So we can say abort if invitation has been used, and then we can specify that we want it to abort with a 404. So we can get rid of that line there, head back and run all the tests in this file, and we're green, so we're good to go. In the next lesson, let's take a look at actually testing submitting the registration form with the invitation code to create this new account for whoever received the invitation email.